Well, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Have you been anywhere where a young person has gotten up to give a talk or read poetry and it's on their... My notes are not on my phone. This is just so I keep track of time. It's amazing what people are doing with technology. It's really very special for me to be here and to be reconnecting tonight with a lot of old friends, and great to see their connections with the rest of you and the work that you're all doing in many niches and corners of life here in the Twin Cities. So I'm honored to be able to be part of it. I wanted to start by telling a story that I think gets us into the kind of framework that I want to talk about tonight. In 1880, a barrel of flour milled out of wheat grown in North Dakota, milled in Minneapolis in the riverfront there where the flour mills were, put on a train that, as I've learned from my work at the Eastside Freedom Library, a train that actually went through Swede Hollow on its way to Duluth. And in Duluth, that barrel of flour was put on an ocean-going ship, and it went across Lake Superior, out the St. Lawrence Seaway, across the Atlantic Ocean, and by the time that barrel of flour landed in the marketplace in Warsaw, Poland, it sold for less than a barrel of flour milled in Warsaw out of wheat that had been grown in Poland. You don't need to understand world trade better than the guy in the White House to realize that international trade doesn't work if there isn't something to put in the ship coming back. And my great-grandparents, many of your great-grandparents might have been in those ships in what was called steerage, in ships that had been built to hold barrels of flour, knowing that human bodies were more flexible than barrels, and people squeezed into those spaces, some of them fleeing pogroms, some of them because they could not get a price for their wheat that enabled them to pay their mortgages. I told this story in 1994, Christmas time, at the governor's mansion on University Avenue, just as Governor Arne Carlson was running up the stairs trying to get away from a group of protesters, led at that time by an organization called the Coalition of the Homeless. And we were challenging Governor Carlson, and again, sort of today he kind of looks like he was pretty good, but Governor Carlson had just come back from Mexico, and we were challenging him about what was he doing in Mexico. It was the moment of the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he said, I was in Mexico opening markets for Minnesota farmers. How can you object to that? And so I managed to get him to stop because I said, and I think I've probably never said this in any other setting, or said, I'm from McAllister College. And he actually stopped. And I proceeded to tell him about that barrel of flour in 1880 in Minneapolis, and said, of course, if you're opening the markets in Mexico for corn grown in Minnesota, there are going to be farmers in Mexico who can't pay their mortgages, and they will be trying to come into the United States. And in 1994, we didn't realize, how large a wave of people that would be and how significant it would be. But for me, both of these stories, which I think are very much connected, are the beginning of trying to understand about patterns of immigration to the United States and to St. Paul. And so the very factors that push, as us sharp-thinking scholars use the complicated four-letter word, the push, that pushed people to leave farms in Poland, or farms in the Ukraine, or farms in Mexico in the late 20th century, that the origination of those forces were right here in the United States, right in the, whatever we want to call it, the global north, the first world, that our desire, our need as consumers, and the satisfaction of those needs by transportation, banks, various kinds of economic interests, pull the very rug out from under people trying to live stable lives. And when people are unable to live stable lives, they look for excuses, they look for scapegoats, they get involved in ethnic conflict, religious conflict, civil wars, fights of all sorts when they're unable to live stable lives. No one becomes an immigrant out of light choosing. They're driven by difficult life chances and life choices. That's not well understood by the people who make policy about migration and immigration. It's very much what has shaped the lives of people who come. One of the things that Sarah, and I should have started by thanking Sarah and Wade for getting me here and coming to the library. But one of the things that Sarah mentioned are these walking tours that I do, and one of my favorite stops on the tour is at an intersection on Payne Avenue where on one side is a bright green painted Los Gallos, a place for immigrants from Central and South America to send money home, money that's being used typically to try to pay that damn mortgage that they can't make enough money off selling their corn to make those payments. And diagonally across the street is what was called the Swedish Savings Bank, built in 1921. And I try to talk to people on the walking tour about how these two things are connected. And we think about, it's hard not to think about the post 9/11 vilification of Somali money sending businesses that were supposedly funding terrorists. And when you begin to realize these patterns, I think you have better chances of understanding what specific experiences and specific stories are. So I talk a lot about push. I talk about another four-letter word, pull. What brings people to particular places? What's brought, in the last 30 years, immigrants from Southeast Asia, East Africa, and Central America to the east side of St. Paul? It's as if, in a weird way, if we could invoke the ghost of Talcott Parsons, who created functionalist sociology, it's weirdly functional that global neoliberalism took 15,000 unionized blue-collar jobs out of the east side of St. Paul, took away the jobs that had been at Whirlpool, 3M, American Hoist and Derrick, Ham's Brewery, and led 15,000 European-descended so-called white families to move, led housing values to plummet, and at the same time, global economic neoliberalism pulled the rug out from under the lives of peasants in Mexico or El Salvador, Guatemala, farmers, peasants in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, peasants, farmers in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and led them to come to Minnesota, and to come to the east side of St. Paul, where at the time, in the 80s, 90s, early 21st century, housing seemed relatively affordable. Many of us are now working on various kinds of organizing and campaigns because that housing is increasingly not relatively affordable, but it was. And they came and they couldn't be factory workers or, as the earlier generations of Swedes and Irish and Germans and Italians who had been railroad workers, dock workers, warehouse workers, domestic servants. Now they're personal care assistants, big box store cleaners, janitors, retail store workers. And one of the things my background as a labor historian tells me is there's nothing inherently low wage about those jobs. There's nothing inherently low wage about any jobs if workers can organize and get a fair deal at the bargaining table and in their lives. So we see these patterns recurring. And the work that we're doing at the East Side Freedom Library is to try to encourage the descendants of those European immigrants and the newcomers from Southeast Asia, East Africa, Central America to share their stories with each other and discover what they have in common, rather than the dominant drumbeat in this country that says we should all be afraid of each other and there's something weird about those Mexicans who want to send money home. And lately, as I've been talking about immigration, I find myself more and more now using the word diaspora. It's very interesting. There's a great book that was written, now it's probably 30 years ago, by a black British scholar named Paul Gilroy, called The Black Atlantic. And Gilroy writes a lot about the Jewish diaspora as a prototype of what he then calls the Black Atlantic. And he's had a tremendous impact. Paul himself was the child of immigrants from Guyana who went to England, and he grew up there and studied with Stuart Hall, another person whose origins lay in the Caribbean, and his career blossomed in England. And I've been thinking a lot about diaspora because I also think that we tend to assume that, first of all, we tend to assume, or maybe nobody in this room does, I shouldn't say we. There are people in this country, and unfortunately the people who make policy, who assume, A, if we had no restrictions, everyone in the world would want to live in the United States. There would be no stopping them. And B, once they get here, they're here to stay. And in fact, when you study immigration, you discover, for instance, that Bulgarians and Romanians had rates of return of 95%. And it's hard to think who talks about Bulgaria or Romania as it's where I'd really like to retire. But people went back. Italians became what my teacher, Dave Montgomery, called proletarian globetrotters, who, and some of us in the room are of the same generation. You may remember a crappy movie about surfing. I can't even remember why I went to see it, called The Endless Summer. And it was about Meshuggah surfers, you know, who were looking for the perfect wave and traveled the world. And Italian migrants, I wouldn't even call them immigrants, traveled the world looking for the endless construction season. So that where was construction going on? And so they went from Italy to the United States, and the United States to Argentina or Venezuela, and then back to Italy, and then to Canada. And there was a great Italian immigration historian in Canada named Bob Harney. And historians are always looking for where can we find the juicy sources, the sources that really tell us stuff. And Bob Harney had this crazy research process that he would go wherever Catholic parishes celebrated saints' days, and he would watch the processions where they would take the statue of the saint out of the church and march it through the streets. And then he would take note as to what money was being pinned to the statue of the saint. And he said any of these parishes, money from all over the world was being pinned to the saint. So Gilroy, Harney, thinking about diaspora. And we've been, in the last 6 months, working on a project at the East Side Freedom Library with diverse immigrants from the Horn of Africa, Oromo, Eritrean, Amhara, Somali, Sudanese, who are trying to, as part of the diaspora, to figure out how can they have a positive impact on the country where they grew up. And it's not clear to me whether, I'm sure some of them will eventually indeed go back. But their desire to understand and the question of the privilege that they have, like I like to think there's never been an immigrant group in the United States where there have not been organizers from the home country who know, like Jewish people do not have a monopoly on guilt and guilt as a way to motivate others. And that they knew the Irish immigrants who were organizing to throw the British out of Ireland, the Croatian immigrants who were organizing to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that any immigrant group has organizers in its midst who are trying to continue to focus people on the political issues back home and to leverage the added resources that they might have that could be used. So it's been an amazing experience. It's an amazing experience to sit in the East Side Freedom Library, the place that we've developed, and to have a program go on for 3 hours and not to understand a single word that people are saying. And to discover that they're able to speak 3 languages, 4 languages, whether it's Tigrian or Amharic or Oromo or Swahili. There is a deli that opened up at the intersection of Payne and Minnehaha called the Caribou Deli, Karibu. And my tour group was walking by the day that they opened, and somebody said, are they trying to, either they're trying to fool us, that it's that other chain, or they just don't know how to spell. And fortunately, I had a young Somali man, a former student of mine, in the group that day, and he said, oh, no, that means welcome. So a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and the next group that I brought by, I proudly told them that caribou means welcome in Somali, and I had another young Somali guy in the group, and he said, oh, no, you're wrong. It means welcome in Swahili. And that was a clue that the Somalis who had opened this deli had already lived as refugees in Kenya before they had come to Minnesota. And just today, I had a conversation with a wonderful Japanese-American photographer who is bringing an exhibit to the library and wants to use it. It's an exhibit about his family's formative experiences in the concentration camps of World War II. And John wants to provoke a series of conversations about family separation and the role of those camps in World War II, but also the many ways that the state provokes family separation today, not just at the border, but also by the way the incarceration system works in the United States. Many ways I've been working with a 25-year-old Somali, wonderful young man who's still an undergraduate student at the U, who's lived here now for 6 years. His father has never been able to come, and he is the male head of household in his family, and it's a miracle that he's getting a college degree, because of course he's also working full-time. Vic was saying he's teaching at Metro State, and I taught at Metro State 30-odd years ago, and I don't think anyone ever realized that there would be Metro State students who worked full-time, went to school full-time, and had a family. It's mind-boggling. So in these experiences, this care about what's going on at home, how can you contribute to make life better at home? If you have been following what's going on in Ethiopia, this young prime minister was elected a year and a half ago, of mixed parentage, Oromo mom and an Amhara dad, and 44 years old, older than the 34-year-old new prime minister in Finland. Holy mackerel! But Abiy Ahmed is a young man in Ethiopia who immediately negotiated a peace treaty with Eritrea after 30 years of declared warfare. And yet, there has been interethnic violence in Ethiopia in the last 3 months that makes it look like Rwanda could happen there. And the people who are telling us, well, there's no jobs for young people, that a new generation is being raised that's unable to read and write because there's no funding for the schools. And how is it possible to organize across ethnic boundaries to create a movement, to create jobs, to fund schools, to transform the society? People who are at the library talking about a truth and reconciliation process they'd like to see. And then the thing that has completely flummoxed me, more than seeing poets get up and read poems off a cell phone, which just seems like, like eating something with your fingers that you should be eating. But anyway, we have we have a friend who has been helping us live stream events on Facebook. These are all things I never thought, that I would ever be doing. And so she live streams the events, and we have these conversations, and we discover, because you get what they call, analytics, 20,000 people are watching these conversations. People in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Eritrea. Amazing. And they're liking my Facebook page. Which is, wow. And then it's, how can we put a donate button out there? All these people watching. But seeing how interested and committed they are. We were fortunate, maybe 6 months ago, we were approached by a group of Mexican immigrants who wanted to hold a meeting at the library. And they, as I would learn, they were affiliated with the new political party that the new president of Mexico belongs to. And again, the whole meeting was in Spanish, and I was fortunate that they thought of me at least and gave me an interpreter. And they were working towards having a national convention to push the new president of Mexico to, one, make it easier for Mexican immigrants in the United States to vote in Mexico. That is how to send their ballots in. Secondly, that the government of Mexico should create businesses for people to send money home so they don't have to use private enterprises like Los Gallos that takes a cut of what people are sending. And then that every Mexican consulate in the United States should dismiss its entire workforce, and the local Mexican community should vote who works at the consulate. And I thought, A, this is fascinating. B, these people are probably all going to go home, and they are trying to think as people and in fact, they referred to living in the United States as, I loved it, living in the Mexican exterior. And I thought maybe they had read Rodolfo Acuña's great book, Occupied America, where he coined the phrase, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Yes, they were living in the exterior. So all of this, it really is rich in ideas, rich in passion. People are writing poetry. People are writing novels. People are wrestling with what it means to be internally in more than one place at once. And it is a richness that they bring to us when we're open to it that gives us an opportunity to reflect on who do we want to be, what has made us, and what can we be in this world. And so even in these grim political times, I find it very inspiring to be around contemporary immigrants. And as a historian, it also leads me to go back and rethink, how did I understand the Irish in the 19th century, the Germans in the 19th century, and on and on. One last story. So we're in a partnership with the Hmong Archives, which is an amazing resource. The most important collection of Hmong documentary materials anywhere in the world. And the organizers of the Hmong Archives organized a reunion of people who had lived in a refugee camp in Laos called Watam Kerbak. And their story was, like many of the Hmong, they had fled the American war in Vietnam and gone to Thailand and lived in the large refugee camps in Thailand. But in 1991, the Thai government closed those camps, and they went back to Laos, where they were put in refugee camps in Laos, and the largest one was called Watam Kerbak. And they were not able to really emigrate to the United States until after the year 2000. And so many of us think of the Hmong as having come in the 1970s and 80s. And there's this very large cohort and a very particularly large group of them here in St. Paul. And the Hmong who were already here looked at them the same way German Jews looked at Eastern European Jews in the 1880s and 1890s. They were country bumpkins. They were really needy. They were going to need a lot of help. They were kind of embarrassing. Maybe it was dangerous even that the Hmong who had been here had finally convinced Americans that they were okay, and now came these people whose difference was so apparent. And so when we think about a place like Neighborhood House on the west side of St. Paul, the Neighborhood House was founded by German Jews who wanted to prevent Eastern European Jews from doing anything that was going to push the anti-Semitism button, that was going to embarrass them or make their lives unstable, having finally assimilated. And so when some people around this reunion that we had, thought critically about the Hmong who had not reached out to the new arrivals in 2005 to 2010, I thought, that's the same experience that my people went through a century ago. It makes all the sense in the world. And it doesn't mean that we don't criticize it, but it gives us a context through which to think about it. So I'm not sure if this is what Sarah and Wade wanted. I think that they wanted a bit of a travelogue from neighborhood to neighborhood in St. Paul, or I'm sorry not to give you that. But I hope that, I want to give you a way of thinking about immigration and thinking about how our lives are connected to these stories, and about the energy and possibility that is contained within these communities, and how much we can benefit from unlocking that rather than trying to lock it up or even keep them out altogether. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or testimonials that you want to give or whatever. I'm relieved that the dessert got served while I was up here, because I was afraid that I was going to be in between you and dessert. So please. Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask you a quick question.
Sure.
Recently heard this report on NPR, and they were talking about the changing demographics in America, and specifically they were talking about the retiring boomers and how families are getting smaller and smaller, and they were sort of tying it in with how we really needed immigrants to come to this country, not only to help us pay our taxes, but also, especially with the increase of baby boomers retiring, we need the immigrants here to help pay for our retirement. And we really depend on them. And, You know, what's going on at the White House now is completely backwards to what we need.
Yeah. Let me think about that or respond in a slightly different way. So I look around, and quite a few of you here are of my generation. You've probably had a relationship with the healthcare system. You know, who took care of you? You know, who was the nurse or the nurse's aide, or, you know, who the number of immigrants who are providing care for us. And I'm fortunate that our work brings us close to the union SEIU Healthcare Minnesota, which represents personal care assistants, and also is building, organizing through a model that was articulated by, and now I'm forgetting her name, the Taiwanese woman who, boy, bad. So anyway, that they're organizing care recipients as well as caregivers. Agen Poo. Agen Poo, that's it, Agen Poo, whose book about personal care assistants and domestics is really extraordinary. She's a MacArthur Genius winner, and but it really, I know that I went for maybe it's too much information, but I went for a sleep study, and everybody working in the clinic that watched over me overnight, every single person was an immigrant. And so, you know, and hopefully because I would always, you know, ask, are you a union member? You know, 'cause, and then you get paid better, you know, and treated better. But, you know, so they're not only, you know, it's a horrible thing to think that the undocumented immigrants are paying into Social Security and they're never going to collect from it. You know, that's definitely redounding to our benefit. But the ones who provide care for us and how important they are, and how those are unfortunately typically low-wage jobs and jobs that people are not recognized and respected for. They're a very important part of our communities and our lives. Anyone else?
Peter, if you could repeat the questions, that would help me.
Oh, great. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the question was about how our lives and immigrants' lives are connected economically. And I mean, it's interesting, you know, people continue to scratch their heads about how is it that we have such a low unemployment rate and so many working people can't make a decent living? You know, and what does that have to do with who's in the country as a worker and who's being hired and employed and exploited? Yeah. Yes, way back there.
Would you comment on this thing I heard the other day that you're going to have to vote county by county or something, whether or not we'll accept refugees?
Right. So the question was about whether we're going to have to vote county by county whether to accept refugees. Apparently, the president signed some sort of executive order, and it's being tested in North Dakota as to whether counties can refuse to accept refugees. It's sort of the exact flip side of sanctuary cities and places that really want to accept and protect immigrants. It appears as if the county in North Dakota that they were so excited, they being the bad guys, that they were so excited about actually voted not to ban immigrants. Of course, you know, somebody needs to be talking to the North Dakotans about their own immigrant roots. And, you know, does it have to be Louise Erdrich who tells them all, well, there's something very interesting about that. Anyone else? Yes, please.
I wanted to ask, how strong is the tradition in East St. Paul of non-immigrant institutions that have been helping or hosting the political organizing of immigrant groups? I was thinking of the example that you have today with the East St. Paul Freedom Library
Yeah.
hosting the Truth and Reconciliation Conference. Is there a long tradition of other organizations doing that in East St. Paul?
Great, thank you. So the question is about what history is there on the east side of St. Paul of non-immigrant institutions being helpful to immigrants. And so history is we have to come to grips with the difficult things as well as the golden examples in our history. When we first started the East Side Freedom Library, which is now 5.5 years ago, two old friends, African American in their 70s, who were artists, and Mel, the man in the couple, had actually worked at Ford, which is how I knew them, and they came to check out the library, and Mel and Rose Smith, who recently had a wonderful show at the Weissman Museum, and they said, we used to not come to this neighborhood. This was not a safe neighborhood for black people. This was a neighborhood that was understood to be a redneck neighborhood. And I think we all know that those kinds of tropes are usually a lot bigger and broader than people's lives really are. But so I come out of a tradition in American labor and immigration history that explores the way different European-descended immigrant groups became white over time, and that part of the price of becoming white, including for Jews, was to participate in racism, more than even turning a blind eye to even participate actively. So the East Side had been a place where different European immigrant groups had supported each other some, had intermarried with each other some, but for the most part, they were not welcoming of people of color, whether they were African Americans, and I think one of the things that many of us don't realize is that most of the Mexicans, and I'll put quotes, most of the Mexicans who came to St. Paul in the early part of the 20th century were Tejanos. They were from Texas. They were not from Mexico. They were seen as Mexicans, but they were in fact American citizens and were migrants from Texas coming to work first in the sugar beet fields and then in the meatpacking plants. But they were definitely, again, a kind of academic, they were the other. And the East Side was not a place where people were very welcoming to the other. And it's been very encouraging to see not only that Latinx and East African and Southeast Asian people are more willing to work together. An organization like the Hmong American Partnership has a Somali organizer on staff and a Karen organizer on staff. They really get it, and they are really practicing it. It's been harder, but 2 nights ago when it was 0 out, we had an event at the library with Chris Lehman, who teaches at St. Cloud and has just published a book called Slavery's Reach, about the impact of slave owners in the early development of Minnesota. 65 people came, most of them white, probably 55 white, 10 black. came to hear Chris and to wrestle with the question of, as he was challenging us, how can we reimagine Minnesota if we don't think of it as, oh, it was a free state and, you know, and slavery was in, I mean, how do we understand the Dred Scott story and so many other parts of our history? People were willing, I like to say that, trying not to get too nasty, but I like to say that the president of Macalester College, whom some of you may know, who's the primary reason that I'm not at Macalester College, that he taught me that the greatest privilege of whiteness is to not have to be uncomfortable. And I felt that he organized his life around not being uncomfortable. And so I've tried to learn from that and to not run away from being uncomfortable. 55 white people showed up willing to be uncomfortable and to talk about how their privilege and their position was connected to the history of slavery. So I think things are changing. It's so important to me to realize it, because if all we did was look at TV, even, you know, listen to Minnesota Public Radio, you know, and listening to these hearings is really disturbing. But, you know, we would think that everybody is vicious and everybody is self-interested. And I see a lot of evidence of people not afraid of being uncomfortable, being interested in growing, and being open-minded about trying to figure out, how the hell did we get here? And what do we do to get out of it? And I think some of us realize we have something to learn from the Oromos and the Eritreans and the Salvadorans and the Guatemalans. We have something to learn from them to figure out how to get out of this mess that we're in. Please.
Are you aware of proposal to raise immigration fees and eliminate fee waivers?
Yes.
Would you like to announce so people, because I think the comment period is in 4 days, end of December.
Yeah.
December 16.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that if you could contact Congresswoman McCollum's office or Senator Smith's office and ask what's going on, you would find out pretty quickly what the proposals are. And you know, as much as there is all of this acrimony about, you know, are we really still in a democracy, and you know, what is this guy able to do, and that a lot of this is happening by executive order, not by bills being passed, and there are ways of, you know, raising the price. So we went through, you know, a couple months back, whoever the guy was that was put in charge of either it wasn't Homeland Security, it's another one of those agencies, where they were going to introduce the rule that if you were likely to become a public charge, you know, was this the Italian guy, Ciccarelli, or it was shocking, you know, to think, what about your grandparents, man? You know, what are you thinking? But you know, the Statue of Liberty and amazing, but you know, ways to make it more expensive for people to fit in. Please, go ahead.
This is actually different.
If
you want to comment, it's commenting to the Federal Register.
To the Federal Register.
The deadline for commenting is December 16. But what it does, it really raises, for example, the application for immigration, citizenship, to more than, raise it by 83%. Mm-hmm. Getting a work permit is close to $500.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna give this information to Sarah.
Great.
But it's very important, I think, because the deadline is December 16.
Thank you. And Vic is,
Yeah,
so Vic knows how to
actually
use
looking
his
at it.
phone, yes.
So the deadline is actually December 30th.
16.
Well, I'm looking at a thing from the Immigrant Law Center that says the deadline for the comment period is December 30th. So maybe it was extended.
Probably.
And the numbers are terrible.
Yep.
Yeah.
The numbers are awful.
Yeah.
Just citizenship alone goes from 640 to 1170.
Uh-huh.
That's the fee.
The fee, yeah, yeah.
For lawful permanent residents, it goes from 1,225 to 2,195. So it's, as you
Yes,
said, it's
yeah, yeah,
horrible.
yeah,
So if
But-
anyone can write comments, they should.
yeah. But it reminds me, you know, of these historical parallels. So in 1923 and 1924, Congress passed an Immigration Restriction Act called the Johnson-Reed Act. And the Johnson-Reed Act said that any particular immigrant group could have as many new immigrants come to the United States as 10% of the number of people that they had here in 1880. This is my favorite example to explain the difference between equality and equity. So everybody was going to be treated equally. Well, the Irish had 4 million people here in 1880, and the Croatians had 0. And so they could each have 10%. And so no one said, we are creating a Croatian bar, you know, like they want to create a Muslim bar or band. But the outcome of what they were proposing was exactly to do that. So I think I'm getting the signal from Sarah that,
We'll go one more.
one more, Grant.
I'm wondering if anybody has written a history of neighborhood house and its impact on our community and the way it's been able to become sort of the home gathering place for Jewish immigrants from Germany, then from Russia, and it's
And Lebanese and Mexicans and,
now
yes.
it's Somali
and
and Hmong.
Hmong, right, right.
How has it done that?
Right,
And
right.
has anybody told their stories?
So there's a 2-volume sort of popular history written by William Hoffman called West Side Tales, I think. And there is a really great book by Harry Boyte, B-O-Y-T-E. Harry's book, Citizens, I'm forgetting the title, but looks particularly at the West Side and the place of neighborhood house within the West Side. So it actually has been a couple of history studies.
In light of that, and in light of what happened
Yeah.
at Tree of Life Synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
you know, how is it for the Jewish community now? Anti-Semitism seems to be connected in some white supremacist mind that Jews are the ones who are really bringing all these immigrants here. What kind of impact is that just having on the life of the community?
Well, maybe somebody who's more active in the Jewish community than I wants to speak to that. Vic, or no?
I don't represent the mainstream Jewish community.
What is the mainstream?
Yes.
My
Yeah.
belief is that we've become pretty paranoid about it.
Mhm.
I don't think we're in danger as some would let you believe.
It's interesting in my relationship with imams and talking to them about their congregations. I'm always shocked.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I should know this, but the amount of fear that's in the community.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you've been listening to NPR the last couple days, this woman who is suing the city of Bloomington, saying that they're denying her free speech rights by not allowing her to videotape Somali kids on playgrounds.
That's the Success Academy at Dar el Farouk.
Right, right. So, you know, this stuff is happening, you know, these kinds of contentions are happening right here. And they're all then opportunities for us to get involved on the side of what we think justice is, whether it's jumping on the Federal Register and making a comment, or supporting this woman, or supporting the Bloomington city government that is trying to, in a seemingly kind of heavy-handed and awkward way, but trying to protect Muslim kids, Somali kids. There's plenty, I don't need to tell the people in this room, there's plenty to do and plenty of opportunities to do it. So, you know, don't let the Trumpers get you down, and you know, and see how much you can learn from the people around us. So, Sarah, please.
Can we thank Peter?